In The Last of Us, is Ellie's anger better explained by trauma? I am Mr. Ross. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania and a certified brain spotting therapist. Today, I'm going to talk about if Ellie was my client and how I would best help her. We'll be going over her presenting issue, some factors that she is dealing with, what I might diagnose her with, how I would treat her, and then some goals that we would have in therapy. This does include some spoilers, and I am speaking predominantly from the game. I haven't seen the show, but I hear that the show is very similar to the events of the first and second games, two of my favorite video games. So let's get started on talking about Ellie. So, if she were to come into my office, I imagine she would be talking a lot about her rage, her anger, her resentments towards Abby, and this vengeance that she has to kill Abby. Or if I see her at the end of the second game, about her having let Abby go and what that experience was like for her. So we're dealing with that anger, we're dealing with grief. She's lost her paternal figure in Joel, who was killed by Abby. And also, she's lost her family. Dina and the baby leave in the second one when Ellie is so focused on vengeance and wants to kill Abby. She's dealing with a lot of grief at this point, too. And she seems to have a difficulty with maintaining relationships in general. That many of her relationships are short term, except the one with Joel, that seems to be the exception. And so let's look at some of the factors she's dealing with, right? Joel is her only paternal figure, her only kind of parent figure that she has. And while there are other mentors and other people in her community, she's not as close to anybody as she is to Joel. But there is complex grief here. Not only did she lose Joel in a traumatic fashion of him being murdered in front of her, but also she was very resentful towards Joel around that time too. So going back a little bit, if you've forgotten, Ellie has the immunity for the zombies. And so she was to go on a medical procedure in order to see if that immunity could be extracted from her in order to save humanity. Well, what ended up happening was, unbeknownst to her while she was asleep, Joel found out this procedure would kill her or had a high likelihood of doing so. And so he got her out of there. Now, Ellie thinks that it simply didn't work, but she finds out the truth that Joel took her out. And so that was against Ellie's wishes. She believes that this was a selfish decision of Joel's. She's hanging on to this resentment, and it has drastically changed their relationship. We saw kind of the joy between those two in the first game or season, and that is basically gone by the second. And anyone who's played the second knows that the tone is drastically darker than the first one. And I believe it's in part because of that change in their relationship. So she has this resentment towards Abby, which I believe there is some of that resentment towards Joel embedded there. Ellie is dealing with frequent trauma throughout the game. So she has to keep being forced out of her home or home base because of the zombie attacks. The zombie attacks themselves can be dramatic. On top of that, she was nearly killed by a cannibal in a very traumatic fashion, and fortunately, she was saved there. She's dealing with potentially, not sure if this is still a factor, but survivor's guilt from the end of the first game, where she has a romantic experience with Riley. They get attacked by zombies, and this is how Ellie finds out she has immunity. Riley dies to the zombie attacks, but Ellie doesn't. And so that may be treated similar to if they were both in a car accident and Ellie survives and Riley didn't. And that potential unfairness that one might feel. So there's a couple of things here that we want to go over with Ellie. Now, diagnosis, I would diagnose her with PTSD. I think this one's pretty obvious. It's chronic. I believe that she's getting triggered all of these times that she's dealing with these resentments. Now, grief is part of this, but I would not diagnose that as like prolonged grief disorder at this point. I simply leave that on the table as one of those major factors that she needs to work through. As far as anxiety, depression, it's tough to say. I really wouldn't peg her with anxiety. I wouldn't. Depression, I'm not seeing any real symptoms of depression except for her mood, but that's better explained too by consequences of the trauma. And I'm not seeing a personality disorder. Yes, she's vengeful to kill Abby, but I don't think that that's due to a personality disorder either. I believe that is far more about the trauma and how it's elevating her nervous system. So let's start looking at treatment. Rapport building is number one here. Gaining her trust, getting her to talk, and using that trust to eventually do somatic therapies, which are therapies specifically to lower the response of the nervous system. We want to lower that stress level in her. You're talking about EMDR, brain spotting, grounding techniques. These things are going to be helpful to her and not just talking about the events. She has to trust me in order to be able to do those sorts of therapies with me. Brain spotting specifically runs on the premise that where you look affects how you feel. And it's through the use of a pointer, putting a pointer in a particular spot, either on someone's screen in terms of telehealth or somewhere in the room for an in-person session. By doing that and looking at that spot for a prolonged period of time, it can actually bring down the anxiety or stress from the nervous system. This might be something very good for Ellie, especially if it's about a particular person or specific memory, certain events that have happened to her. And we might use it on ones that she's more willing to work on at the beginning and then work our way to ones that are the most traumatic, such as when Joel was murdered or when she found out that Dina and the baby left. Now, by processing that trauma, we lower the nervous system. And I think at that point, it makes it easier for us to discuss forgiveness, which is the idea of letting go of the emotions against somebody else. Forgiveness isn't necessarily about the other person. It is primarily about you and being able to let go of that anger so you no longer have to hold on to it. And that's much easier to do if Ellie feels safe and if she feels more confident and able to manage her emotions. We might start to discuss that. Now, spirituality, too, can be helpful with this concept, especially if we're talking about the concepts of justice and mercy, which seem to also go with spirituality, treating others fairly and also being compassionate towards others. It's not explicitly stated what Ellie's spiritual beliefs are in the games. And if they were, or if you have an idea of what they might be, post them in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you have to say and what your input is. I might have that conversation with her. That might help in forgiving Abby, forgiving Joel, and also working through the loss of Joel. She may even have to forgive Dina, and especially, I believe that she would have to forgive herself. Even though, in some ways, not really her fault that she's gotten to this point, although it is her decision at this point, choose to stop the violence, stop the vengeance. Overall, it's the goal of getting out of survival mode because in essence, she never had a chance of getting out of survival mode, at least to this point. But we're seeing towards the end of the second game that the world that they're in seems to be shaped differently, that the zombie apocalypse is less frequent or less encompassing than it used to be. So then, once she succeeds with all of those things, or maybe as she's simultaneously working on these traumas, nervous system response, grief, we might start to talk about who is Ellie. What is her identity outside of vengeance and survival? That curiosity and that kindness that we saw in the first game, those creative moments like in the zoo that really showed how she connected with Joel and how sweet and innocent and loving of a person that she is. Well, can she connect with that person? Is she still that person deep down? Or is that some part of her? Figuring out what are her relationships going to look like? What is work going to look like, especially in a post-apocalyptic world? What is her contribution to society going to be as maybe she's still working through the guilt that she did not undergo that procedure? Well, what does she do? Does she see doctors to see if they can still extract the immunity? If zombies no longer exist in this next part of the game or in the show, is there another way that she can contribute to the rebuild? And so having those conversations with Ellie might be important. Well, what are your thoughts on Ellie and treatment that I would help her with? Please post them in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. If you are interested in counseling or life coaching services, you can contact me at mrrosscreations.com. And if you're into my creative works, you can check out my books on my website as well. Thank you for watching and hope you have a wonderful day.